evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Georgette Vigil. I am the Senior Director for Alumni Engagement and Outreach at Colorado Law. During the presentation, you can ask questions using the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Questions will be monitored as they are submitted. You can vote on questions that interest you the most. Professor Chen will respond to questions following the presentation. As a reminder, everyone is on mute. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dean Anaya. Dean Anaya has been Dean of Colorado Law since 2016. He is an internationally recognized scholar and author in international human rights and issues concerning Indigenous peoples. He served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples from 2008 to 2014. In addition to his teaching and scholarship, Dean Anaya cases involving Indigenous people, human rights in domestic and international tribunals. Please welcome Dean Anaya.
Thank you, Georgette, and hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Colorado Law Talk, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, featuring Professor Ming Chen. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Colorado sits upon the land within the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Peoples territories. Further, we acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. The Colorado Law Talk series was launched in 2017 to share the groundbreaking research, knowledge, and ideas of the Colorado Law faculty with a broader legal community in the Denver area, and especially now that we've gone virtual, also with the legal community throughout the state and beyond. The mission of Colorado Law includes not just providing an exceptional legal education, but also engaging in research and producing influential scholarship with impact in the world around us. And this scholarship, of course, advances our public service mission. Professor Ming Chen's work exemplifies our mission. Professor Chen brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of immigration and the contemporary problems faced by our country around immigration and citizenship. She is a graduate of Harvard University and New York University School of Law, and she received a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in jurisprudence and social science. She joined the faculty of Colorado Law in 2011 and currently serves as the faculty director of the Immigration and Citizenship Law program. She has multiple publications, including her recent book, Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, an Inside Look at the Newest Americans. And I understand that she'll be drawing from the ideas in that book for her talk this evening. You can find out more about Professor Chen's impressive background in the detailed biography that's been made available to you. And I'm very happy to now turn the program over to Professor Chen.
Great, thank you so much, Jen, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here tonight, including our IT team, Georgette, Yesenia, those who make the Zoom world happen for us. I want to begin with the occasion for us being together today. Today, as you may know, is Constitution Day, and it's also Citizenship Day. The 14th Amendment fittingly says that all persons who are born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. And that's what I want to use as my opening point, to talk about what it means to be a citizen in the United States. Now, several times a year, I bring law students with me to naturalization workshops where we assist green card holders with their applications for citizenship. And in the fall of 2016, we volunteered at a high school in Aurora and noticed that the lines to sign up for help with these applications was getting longer and longer and longer. And it made us wonder why that was. Why were there so many immigrants there who were seeking citizenship, even though we know that in an average year, only about 50% of those who are eligible for citizenship end up actually applying for it. The other question that we had was why they were all coming forward today. So many of the immigrants that we met were immigrants who had been in the country and eligible for citizenship for 10 years, 15 years, or more. But why was it that November 2016, so many immigrants were coming forward? Well, most of what we heard as we talked with the immigrants who were there to register was that the reason they finally came forward to take that last step before citizenship was because they felt they could no longer afford not to be citizens. And we heard this answer again and again. The individual stories that we heard were really rich and varied, but they all had the same common theme of seeking citizenship from the harsh immigration policies and the unwelcoming attitudes and the harsh rhetoric they were hearing during the presidential campaign of 2016. So their response became a portal for my study into understanding how immigrants seek citizenship in many different legal categories and in many different senses of the word citizenship. As Dean and I had mentioned, this project blossomed into a book that just came out with Stanford Press about a week ago. And so I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about that project. The book is called Pursuing Citizenship in the Enforcement Era, and it essentially has 3 chunks to it. The first chunk talks about what is wrong with the country that we have now and how it is that immigrants like the ones I mentioned end up feeling so unwelcome in the United States, even as they're trying to belong. The second chunk of the book tells stories from immigrants that myself and research assistants at CU Law School interviewed. We interviewed over 100 immigrants in total, mostly around the state of Colorado. So chapters 4 and 5 tell you their stories. And then the final chapter in the book begins to ask how we can move forward. How is it that we can start to remedy the harms that I've laid out? So those 3 parts will also be the roadmap for the presentation I give you today. So let's start with how we got here. There's a common understanding of immigration law as a binary. The idea is that you're either an immigrant or a citizen. You're legal or you're illegal. And that makes you either an insider or an outsider. And the dividing line is usually the border. Well, this common understanding is somewhat incomplete. My book tries to take a broader view of citizenship. So first, instead of the binary, I think of citizenship as being arrayed on a spectrum. And so if you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a picture of what citizenship actually looks like. For many people, they are coming in the United States in one of different statuses. They might be entering into the United States with a green card, or they might be coming on a temporary visa, or they might be coming with no documents. Some of them, once they're inside the United States, might go on to pursue a path to formal citizenship, whereas some of them will not have that option. Some people will move forward, some people will get stuck along the way. So as you can see, citizenship is a pretty complicated affair. It's much more than the binary that is commonly believed. Now, not only that, all of this that I just described to you is what I consider immigration law versions of immigration. That is to say, this is what it means to have legal status. Citizenship, as I define it in the book, has both a formal and a substantive dimension. So the formal citizenship is essentially what we've just talked about, all the different ways that someone can be in legal status in the United States. The substantive side is where my social science background comes in. And that is a measure of how people fit into society, how well they fit socially, how well they fit legally, how well they fit economically, and how well they fit politically. So these experiences essentially of whether you feel like you belong, whether you feel like you have a good job, and whether you feel like your voice matters, are all part of the experience of what it means to be a full citizen in the United States. So essentially that's the theory in the book. And I want to now bring that theory to life by telling you some of the stories from the immigrants that I met. So as I mentioned, myself and a team of CU Law students set about interviewing more than 100 immigrants in the United States, in Colorado. And we didn't pick them randomly. We picked them with a certain scheme in mind. So in particular, we focused on 6 different legal categories of immigrants. There are people from different countries, from different races, who speak different languages, and who were living very different lives in Colorado. Roughly, we organized them into these 4 categories. And essentially, this is a very simple 2x2 matrix. Along the top, it says formal citizenship. And then along the side, it says substantive. And then there's essentially a high and a low for each of those. And so if you consider box number 1 here, it's someone who's high in formal citizenship and also high in substantive citizenship. That might be someone like a green card holder who has a legal permanent status and also feels very much like they belong in the United States. Even higher in this box perhaps would be a US born citizen, although they weren't part of the population that I interviewed. If we go down to box 3, this lower corner, you would have the opposite extreme, someone who is very low in formal citizenship and also low in social belonging. That might be, for example, an undocumented immigrant who's living a life in the shadows, struggling to pay bills and without much political recourse. That person might be considered the opposite extreme of what we just described. And then in the 2nd and 4th box, you have the in-betweens. So essentially that's the scheme I'm looking at. And where I want to start is the 2 categories of immigrants that have a high level of formal legal status. And just to put that in regular parlance, these are the permanent legal residents. These are the green card holders. These are the refugees. And these are the non-citizens who served in the military. Now, as I mentioned to you in my opening, many of these immigrants are people I met at naturalization workshops, such as the ones that are happening this weekend from the same organization, although now virtually. And you'll see pictured in the middle, Salvador, who is an immigrant himself and also works for the community organization that was hosting the citizenship workshop. I know that Salvador came to the United States as a teenager from Mexico, and that he spoke about his own involvement with the organization and his belief in the importance of naturalizing because he felt that it was important to have a say. And he wanted to be able to speak up during a time that seemed rather dark and scary for his community. One of the other immigrants I interviewed for the book, who also was someone that I met at this workshop, was a woman named Liz. And she said that having her papers, and by this she means not only entry papers, but a green card, having her papers really helped. She felt that without them in conversations with law enforcement or other government officials, essentially she felt like she was mute. She felt as well that coming forward from a green card and taking that last step of naturalizing was an insurance policy against all the different immigration laws that she saw in the news that were changing day by day. Now remember, these are Latino green card holders who were already inside the country, were already eligible for citizenship, and had been living here for more than a decade. None of these immigrants are the direct targets of immigration enforcement. And yet what they were telling me is that they were coming forward because they were fearful of the immigration climate nonetheless. Now the gentleman over to the right side of the screen is named Bob Marshall. He's a scientist here in Boulder. He's actually a professor at CU Boulder, and he's a Canadian green card holder. His story is a little bit different from Salvador and from Liz, but it does have some similarities. He came to the United States about 20 years ago for college as an international student. He stayed on for graduate school. He worked for a while, and then eventually he became a green card holder through marriage. Now, when I met Bob, he had not actually applied for citizenship, even though he had been eligible a long time, just like Salvador and Liz. What I thought was interesting is that when we had coffee, he had actually already filled out his N-400, the application form for becoming a citizen, but he was still trying to decide whether to file it. And when I asked him why he had filled it out, if he wasn't actually going to turn it in, he said, I've thought about filling it out many times. And the reason that I finally did so today was because of the travel ban. And the travel ban he was referring to was the 2017 travel ban that barred individuals from Muslim majority countries from coming to the United States. As you might guess from the picture, Bob is not Muslim. He's not from a Muslim majority country. As I mentioned, he's from Canada, but nonetheless, he too felt that the travel ban was a wake-up call and made him aware that having a green card, essentially being anything short of an actual and official citizen, would not be enough to know that he was fully secure in the United States. Just as a point of interest, I saw Bob recently. He still hasn't filed the N400, which is in keeping with many Canadians who feel like they are virtually or de facto citizens. All right, so that's the first half of our green card holders. I want to highlight these two case studies because I think a lot of times people don't realize that refugees and non-citizens who serve in the military are also legal permanent residents with green cards and a path to citizenship. So these pictures are not actually the immigrants that I interviewed, but they're placeholders. They'll stand in for the stories I want to tell. Over to the left, I have a representation of Amir, who's an Iraqi refugee to the United States. He, as a refugee, belongs to a group that's very different from the ones I was describing. Refugees almost always naturalize in the United States. It's something like 80 to 90% of refugees that naturalize, as compared to the 50% or so that I said typically naturalize of the general population. Now, Amir said that he was very grateful to be in the United States for the chance to have safety and also to have the opportunity to naturalize. And yet, he said, he will always be a refugee and never an American. That really stuck with me because it showed that even though he had formal citizenship, his sense of social belonging, that sense of substantive belonging, was something that was sorely lacking. On the other hand, we have on the right several non-citizens who have served in the military. Jose came to the United States from Mexico as a young child. He grew up idolizing Captain America, he said. His parents had a green card, and so he became eligible for a green card as well. And he decided to enlist in the military because he wanted to give back to his country. It turned that he returned from his tour of duty and was really proud of the service. He was proud to feel like an American, even though he hadn't actually applied for citizenship. It didn't mean that his life was easy. He had brushes with law enforcement. He got in trouble with the police. At times he struggled to find work. But he said that he felt that his military service was essentially a second passport in his dealings with the police. It made him more of an insider. The only catch with that is that he thought it was a second passport when he actually didn't have the first passport because he had never applied for citizenship. And when I asked him why, he said that it felt to him like citizenship was just a technicality. He had already lived his life here. He had given to his country. He felt in every sense that he was already a citizen, except in the official sense, the one that the US government needed to be able to recognize his belonging. So to bring together these stories, these are just 4 snapshots of about 60 different interviews that fit into this category. But I wanted to bring across some of the themes. You know, in order to answer this question of why the trend in naturalization has been up and up and up as the immigration climate has become more and more hostile, we look to these stories. They're all green card holders who have a path to citizenship. So in that sense, they all have the formal citizenship that I mentioned. They have a mixture of substantive experiences though. For example, the social belongings seem to really differ, whether someone was Latino or a white majority immigrant from Canada. There were differences whether the immigrant was more or less educated as well. The third thing that was in common was across these stories was that the immigration enforcement regime, all of these harsh immigration policies were starting to cast a shadow over the reasons that people would want to become a citizen. These were the darkening motivations. And so what that meant was that immigrants were increasingly talking about their desire to be able to travel freely without worrying about a travel ban. That's probably one of the more common examples of an immigration benefit. They were interested in being able to vote because they wanted to vote against these policies that seemed so troublesome for their community. They wanted to have protection from immigration enforcement. Again, even though many of them were not targets for immigration. They also wanted to have a strategy for inclusion. And this is what I collectively call defensive citizenship as a reason to understand the rise in citizenship. And one to really ask ourselves, is that the kind of motivation that we want to see? Now, moving from the why to how, it's where this story gets a little more complicated. But the simple version that I'll put forward is that their relationship between the formal citizenship and substantive was one of a spiral. The sense of a spiraling sense of citizenship insecurity, where legal status starts to matter more during an enforcement climate. And in that time, lacking legal status then gets in the way of being able to fit in every other regard. That was the basic story that was coming out of the green card holders. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit to tell you about some of the other people that I met. And the themes here might have seemed pretty different. The themes here might be different in some ways. Instead of talking about the stories of green card holders, what I want to do is to elevate the stories of those who don't have the formal path to citizenship. So there were a couple different categories that fit in here as well. If you look at the left side of the box, again, these are the people who were either lacking formal citizenship because they were undocumented immigrants, or one step in from that, those who were dreamers, those who had the deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA status, which gives them some legal protection, but not a permit and not an ability to naturalize in the United States. Some other immigrants who fell in this category were those on temporary visas. International students are probably one of the more well-known. They're part of our community in the university as well. So these are some of the stories that I wanted to highlight to understand not only what it means to pursue a path to citizenship, but also to not have a path like that, or to not have an assured path like that in the United States. So let's turn toward the more familiar of these stories, probably the dreamers. We've been hearing a lot about the dreamers because they've been the target of so many policies of late. One of the women I met on campus, and these are all pseudonyms for the dreamers that are in the book, but we'll say that this woman's name is Gabrielle. And she had a fairly typical story as a dreamer. She came to the United States when she was very young. She grew up in the United States, feels very much American, is a fluent English speaker, and essentially her experience is summed up by this Time magazine cover. She would say, as would many of her friends, "We are Americans, asterisk, just not legally," right? And that was very much how she understands her experience in the United States, that even though she doesn't have formal citizenship, substantively, she feels as American as anybody else. Now, in contrast to that, we have an example of an international student toward the bottom, and also a high-skilled worker, someone who you might imagine is a scientist on an H-1B, either at CU Boulder in the community. Now, starting with the international student, the experience that I was told about was one of coming to the United States to learn, maybe to work on an OPT toward the end of that time, maybe to have a green card if it ever became possible, but that seemed like a pretty distant possibility. If, however, the green card became available, the story was that that might be of interest, but it might not. And it would really just depend on what the economic opportunities looked like. Now compare this, on the other hand, with the gentleman in the upper right corner, a gentleman from China who was working in the United States on a temporary visa. He had been in the United States on a series of temporary visas, always in legal status, but never with a sure path to citizenship. He told me that he was getting worried about the different policies he was hearing about. And what he said was that he didn't want to be in a position where his future was dependent on the discretion of some government official that he's never met, instead of on his own job qualifications. So the themes that are coming out of these stories are very different from each other, but they still share some of these same elements that we've been talking about. For this category of people who are in between, they're the legal liminal categories, they're lacking in formal citizenship. What they share in common is they don't have an assured path to US citizenship. Like the other group, they also have a mixed sense of social belonging. For the DACA recipients, I heard a lot about a sense of belonging, even though there wasn't that sense of legal status. And the lack of legal status over time actually started to constrain the integration. The interviews I did with DACA recipients were happening just before the 2017 rescission of DACA, that then took 2 years to work its way through the court system until it was finally decided this summer that DACA would remain on the books, although it's still in pretty shaky status in terms of whether or not new DACA applications will still be accepted. So the story that I'm telling you is the more straightforward story. I know in conversations I've had since then that many DACA recipients are actually feeling a lot less sure about that sense of belonging now that their legal status has jumped through so many hoops and run through so many obstacles. Also a dimension of substantive belonging, the international students that I mentioned, as well as the H-1B temporary workers. For those immigrants in the United States, they're usually coming from a position of economic stability. So in that sense, one might think of them as relatively privileged immigrants. And yet at the same time, they spoke of a sense of not belonging, a feeling like their time here was temporary, that they were just guests in the United States. Their decisions about whether they would stay, even if they were given the chance, was highly dependent on what would be best for their future, what would be best for their job, what would be best for their family. It was a transactional mindset. Most of all, what struck me for both the DACA recipients and the temporary immigrants was that they were not only unsure about their present, they were also unsure about their future. And the fact that they were unsure about one made it difficult to be able to plan their life. This is something that psychologists actually call an indication of trauma, this forestalled sense of the future. And it's something that I saw in both categories of immigrants. So I'm going to start to wrap up here. I wanted to bring together some of the themes. Again, I've given you about 6 stories out of, again, about 100 that are part of the book. The themes through all of the different stories are constant. Those who are immigrants, who have anything less than full formal citizenship, experience themselves as not belonging in the United States. And this ran up and down that citizenship spectrum that I laid out for you at the start of the talk. That sense of belonging substantively, whether that meant in terms of work or in terms of social belonging or in terms of political and civic engagement, that was something that was inhibited by the lack of formal status. And the reason that I gave, because of this enforcement-minded immigration policy climate that we're in. Enforcement really amplified that sense of citizenship insecurity in the United States. I found this to be true across legal status, wherever people were on the spectrum. It was even present across differences in race, income, profession, countries of origin, and whether or not their own country was the subject of an immigration ban or a target of enforcement. I did want to add a footnote here that I had to end the writing of my book in March of 2020. That was when the final version of the manuscript was due to Stanford Press. That meant that I stopped working on the book just about when the pandemic was starting. And it did make me wonder how I would change or extend any of the stories were I to know today what things would be like today. And I think what I would say is that in the 6 months since I stopped working on the book, our current immigration climate has only magnified the kinds of stories that I'm telling you. There have been about 50 immigration-related policies since the initiation of COVID-19 in the United States. And so the types of fears that people spoke of being unable to travel to the United States on a temporary basis, even on a tourist visa, being unable to find work in the United States on a green card, being able to stay in the United States as a student, as an international student at a university like CU. All of those policies were things that the immigrants that I interviewed didn't even know about at the time that we spoke. But I could only imagine going back to them today, seeing what's happened over the last 6 months, that they would probably only tell the same story in even starker relief. So this leads us to the logical conclusion. Many of you who are listening today are lawyers by training or lawyers in training for the law students who might be listening. And lawyers like to solve problems. So I wanted to conclude the book with some thoughts about how we could change course, how we could actually start to imagine a different kind of immigration policy than the one I've described to you today. And these would be some of the key principles. First, in thinking about the North Star of immigration policy that I've set out in this book is the idea of integration. And I've stolen this idea of thinking about a North Star from my friend and attorney, who also happens to be a MacArthur Genius Grant winner, who was having a conversation with a room full of immigration attorneys and reformers and activists. And he asked the room to just pause for a moment. Everyone had been so busy and had been working so tirelessly to file lawsuits, to write op-eds, to stage protests against the latest immigration policy of the day. And he asked that room full of immigration reformers, if you could step back from it all, what would you say is the North Star for all of your efforts? If you weren't constantly trying to battle the fire hose, if you weren't constantly drinking from the fire hose, what would you say is the long-term vision for your strategy? And for me, the answer was something around integration. And partly that's involved this answer of broadening the conception of citizenship in the way that I've spoken of, considering both the formal and the substantive dimensions of belonging. Part of it is a matter of considering immigrants as citizens to be. In the terms of Hiroshi Motomoro, who's a longtime member of the faculty here at CU Law and is also a dear friend and colleague, to think about immigrants as Americans in waiting. Another core principle in the book is that we should think about building pathways to citizenship for all immigrants. You probably hear in the news all the time, you certainly hear in the campaign trail a lot of promises about building a path to citizenship for dreamers. That's something that has been a topic of conversation for more than 10 years in Congress. And at various points in time, there has been support in both parties, just never at the same time in the House and the Senate with a president who would be willing to sign that legislation. But there has been bipartisan support for that idea of a path for undocumented immigrants. I feel very much that that path ought to be part of the program. However, I also think we need to think about what it would be like to build a pathway for other categories of immigrants. So for green card holders, needing to think about ways to streamline their path to citizenship. In separate work, I've studied the citizenship backlog, which has many immigrants waiting upwards of 2 years to become citizens, even after they filed that N-400 we talked about at the outset. That means that people who were in the queue last year will still not be able to vote in this year's election. So needing to be able to find ways to streamline that process would make things easier. As of next week, I believe, I think it's October 2nd, the fee that one pays to file for citizenship is going up to almost $1,000. That would be another example of an obstacle that could be made easier for a green card holder who wants to become a US citizen. In the second category of temporary visitors, this one is a little more tricky. The international students I referred to don't have a straight shot to citizenship. In fact, if they were to tell me in my interviews that they actually did come to the United States intending to become a citizen, that would actually be evidence of immigration fraud. Their intent to come has to be just for the period of study. But that's not to say that they can't make changes along the way. Many F1 visa holders or international students go on to become high-skilled workers with H-1Bs, and the H-1B path does have the option to adjust status to a green card. So part of the one of the policy reforms that I put forward in the book is the idea that we should model more of the temporary visas along the lines of the H-1B so that there is the option to be able to naturalize after a period of time and after meeting all of the requirements for a green card in the United States. But the point in more general terms is to tailor the path to citizenship to the category of immigrant that we're talking about. Now, there are more details that are in the book, and so I'll leave you the details if you wanted to actually take a look at the book. There'll also be some other events where I'm talking about the book in the future. But I want to stop with this final word. I think many people think that immigration is broken, that it's a very sad story in America. The book that I'm offering does capture some of that in the stories, but I also think it is more optimistic. I think it's optimistic enough that when I finally sat down to start writing the book, I almost didn't want to write it anymore because it felt so unrealistic to me in 2016 to start writing a book about immigrant integration, just as our policy was taking a pretty deep dive in the direction of enforcement. Even though enforcement had been going on for 30 years, it was definitely moving more quickly that way. On the other hand, I also had trouble stopping my work on the book because there kept being more and more examples of this enforcement error that I talked about that was shaping the experiences of these immigrants who are seeking citizenship. And because the examples kept coming, it made me glad that I had continued work on the book because it said to me that we did need something like this. We did need to find a new way to think about immigration policy and to find a new way forward. So I'll conclude there and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Looks like we have some questions that have come in. The first question, we'll just dive right in to continue this path forward. What kind of volunteer opportunities exist for non-immigration specialists to contribute to helping this situation? And that's from Mark Hansen.
I love that question. It's always so wonderful when people want to help. Well, I'll start with the green card holders that I mentioned. The citizenship workshops I described are ones that don't require you to be a lawyer to help. A lot of the law students that I had with me already knew a lot more than they even needed to know to be able to help someone file an application. So essentially the specific workshops are ones that are organized on a quarterly basis. And usually the American Immigration Lawyers Association will offer a 1-hour training at the beginning of the day. And then people will sit down one by one with the different applicants who are there to help them with their individual applications. So it's often the case, these are the cases that have been pre-screened. So the more complicated cases they send out for legal referral. But the simpler cases, really they just need immigrants to have someone to sit down with them and to walk through the form very carefully, all 20 pages of it, and make sure that they don't miss anything along the way before they file it. So that's one thing that someone can do without having a JD. Aside from that, this might seem so simple that it is silly to mention, but I think it is actually very important to mention, which is creating that sense of welcome. You know, I started by saying today's Citizenship Day and it's also Constitution Day. It's also called Welcome Week. And a lot of that idea of building a sense of welcome at a local community is what makes all the difference to the immigrants that I spoke to.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. There are lots of opportunities people can tap into. Our next question from the ever famous anonymous attendee. How do you think in this upcoming election, the feeling of not belonging for immigrants will change? Do you think it will improve in a Biden presidency or will it remain the same?
It's always very difficult to forecast the future. I think I'll answer this by stepping back for a moment to highlight something that maybe didn't come across clearly enough in the book, which is that when I talk about the enforcement error, I'm not actually just talking about the Trump administration. I would say that the enforcement error in immigration policy in the United States has been going on for at least 30 years. I mean, essentially since 1986, every 10 years or so, we have a piece of comprehensive legislation that makes the immigration law more and more draconian. So I would say over that stretch of time across many different presidential administrations, there's been a mounting sense of unease, a sense of this citizenship insecurity. And so that said, I don't think simply changing to a new president, if that's what happens in November, will solve the problem. I think there will always be this sense of an insider and an outsider. And you know, that might actually be one of the enduring features of having a world that's organized into countries with borders, is that there will always be someone who's on the inside and the outside. So I think that sense of not belonging will always be there for some. However, as I said, in trying to make that more concrete, like what is it that keeps someone from being able to belong? Is it having the skills or the education or the social ties and connections or an ability to contact a representative? those are the things that I think can start to create the path of belonging in the United States.
Thank you. Our next question is from Matthew Von Werder. To what extent have the fears and insecurities of immigrants, like those mentioned in these case studies, been bolstered or magnified in the past 4 years, and even recent revelations of immigration policy and treatment of immigrants or those perceived as being not American enough?
So I said that this book is not just about the Trump administration, but I would certainly say it includes the Trump administration and many of these policies that Matthew might be referring to. You know, I'm going to go out on a gambit here and say, you know, I've already told you about a lot of different immigrant stories. I think in this climate, you could even extend beyond the people that I actually interviewed. When you try to think about who's safe, right, that was the crux of the answer to why it is that people wanted to become a citizen, because they didn't feel safe without it. So if you think about what it requires to become safe, it's not just having a legal visa, it's not just having a green card. And I would say these days, it might not even be just becoming a naturalized citizen, because over the last few years, we've revitalized this idea of denaturalization, essentially an undoing or stripping away of citizenship that's been so hard fought and hard won. And there are even debates about birthright citizenship and whether that's something we should continue to extend. So I would say that it really highlights the idea that unless you are a full US citizen, substantively and formally in terms of legal status, these days it's really hard to feel like you belong. And I did notice I think we skipped one question from Harry Budasarto, who I know is a CU law grad and actually helped me to arrange some of these interviews. I don't think he's actually in the book himself. But he had asked a question of, you know, what it's like if you are already a naturalized citizen and yet you still feel unwelcome in the United States. And that is a question that I wanted to be able to address, because I think the climate that we're in shows a lot of continuities behind the sense of citizenship insecurity that I've described for immigrants, and also the unease that racial minorities feel in the United States. And it's one of the reasons I do think about immigration as being on a spectrum, and one that jumps over that line of being a citizenship, because I think a lot of these themes would have resonance as well in broader conversations about race relations and equality and civil rights.
Excellent. Thank you for seeing that one from Harry. We have some more questions. How many people in this country are vulnerable to deportation? If they are here illegally, why have they not been deported?
So the law professor version of this would start by explaining how complicated it is to describe someone as being undocumented or out of status. I think the questioner is mostly asking about those who enter without inspection. In immigration law world, we call them iwis. Outside of immigration law world, I think that's what a lot of people are thinking about when they talk about undocumented immigrants who have come to the United States and are living here illegally. The last estimates show that there's about 11.3 million people who are undocumented in the United States. That means that they are theoretically eligible for deportation unless they are able to find some other way to stay in the United States. So for example, the Dreamers that I mentioned have this limited legal protection that gives them 2 years at a time as a reprieve from deportation. Or someone might get something called a U visa if they are the victim of a crime, and then become eligible for a green card. But generally speaking, 11.3 million people is more than the government is able to deport, even if it puts all of its resources into immigration enforcement. And that's the reason that governments make choices. And so, you know, under President Obama, there was a system of priorities for who was going to be removed. Was it more important to remove the person who had a criminal conviction on their record? Or was it more important to remove the grandmother who had lived in the United States for 30 years and, you know, had simply let her visa lapse? You know, and that system of priorities is one that's always available in a presidential administration. But I think it's a matter of capacity, but also a matter of political will.
Wow. There's it's so deep, the process, and more questions. If people are in this country illegally, wouldn't granting them a path to citizenship encourage people to violate our immigration laws? This is what Republicans are accusing Democrats as supporting open borders. Do Democrats support open borders?
So I'm going to focus on this piece about open borders because it's one that I think is interesting and is it's a conundrum. I mean, this is a question I get asked from people from the right and the left. A lot of people that with whom I share a lot of political sympathies have said to me that my book doesn't go far enough because I'm actually not calling for open borders in the book. I'm talking about a system that allows pathways to citizenship, that increases the access to legal channels for migration, and that provides some reprieve for those who have fallen into undocumented status. So in that sense, I'm not talking about an open border regime. I'm talking about something that is pretty regulated, but that's something that is more open and more compassionate than the system we have now. But I also get criticism on the other side saying that the book goes too far, and maybe that's a little bit closer to some of the sentiments that are expressed in the question. And I think that the question of whether or not the book goes too far depends in some way on how you understand the possibility of having equality for people without regard to their citizenship. And I think that's where, offering the imagery of, people being citizens in waiting or Americans in waiting, if that's something that they want at some point in the future, and if they meet the qualifications, I think that is something that, can change a picture of what it is that we owe to someone who's living their life in the United States. But mind you, not everybody wants to stay. I mean, that was also something that was coming through in the stories, that more and more people are actually given the option or choosing not to stay because they feel like the climate is so unwelcoming.
Well, I certainly look forward to reading your book. We have one more question here in the queue from Helen Morrow. Thanks for your thoughtful research and talk, Ming. I largely agree with you, though I have one broad question I'm wrestling with and wonder your thoughts. It is, even if restriction and to citizenships have mostly cons and few pros, which is an analysis, I agree with both scholarly and personally. Is there any hidden value? So to speak, in some of them, we call part of the reactive ethnicity in sociology. That is, we say we prefer more consonant welcome and integration. But in the long term, does this insecurity and the fight or inclusion and belonging that it engenders help to activate people into political activity in search of citizenship? Or in other words, you said, do we really want defensive citizenship? I would say no, not ideally, but also that defensive citizenship has also helped us push the US in the right direction. For example, civil rights movement and so forth. Just curious if you see any value in defensive citizenship still, maybe not for immigrants, but for the polity.
Great. Thank you for the question. Helen and I have known each other since graduate school, and as you might guess from the sophistication and the length of her question, she is a professor now at Tufts University in sociology. But yeah, this question, it is true. There's a big normative assumption that's buried in my book, which is that the fact that people would want citizenship because they are fearful, the fact of defensive citizenship, that is something negative. That is something that I seem to be saying in the book, that it devalues the idea that someone would want to become a citizen for that reason, the push instead of the pull of apple pie and American flags and patriotic music. And that is something that I had to struggle with. I think what I will say is this. I mean, there's a certain way in which I do believe, this might be the lawyer in me coming out more than the social scientist in me, although I have a foot in both worlds. I do believe that there is value in having formal citizenship. And so even if someone is pushed toward naturalizing for defensive reasons, I do feel that there is value in that. There are a lot of studies that show that simply becoming a naturalized citizen can then help you to work on those other dimensions, that some people start to feel more American after they actually naturalize. So I think there's value there. And as I've spent some time talking about tonight, in an enforcement climate, I think it's actually critical. I think it's actually just a basic necessity to be able to live a full life in the United States, that you have the option to become a citizen, to actually become one. But that, I do think that there is something that is maybe unattractive about that, of having people become citizens because they feel they are forced to, rather than because they want to. And I think that that idea, you can approach in a couple different ways. I think one way to think about it is that there are studies that look at citizenship in many different countries around the world over longer periods of time than I studied. And they do show that if someone has a defensive push towards citizenship, that tends to unravel over time. That uptick that I looked at, which people might think of as a really positive development, starts to go down at some point. At some point, the sense of being unwelcome, right? Having a hostile context of reception is the term that sociologists use, does start to erode away that sense of belonging. But the last thing I want to say about this question is this. I actually think that that push toward formal citizenship could be a grounds to bring people together across different areas of the political spectrum. Because if the view of Republicans or others who have been more skeptical of having this more open path, if not open border for immigrants, if their position is that they want people to be here who want to be Americans, that is what the book is calling for too. Right? And if others believe that they want to have a very open stance toward immigration, then they obviously have no problem with this argument either. So I think there's a way that this can actually bring people together. And one of the people that I interviewed, Kit Tainter, at the time was the refugee coordinator for the state of Colorado. She's now doing other work with immigrants. But I remember her pointing out to me that the Refugee Act in the 1980s was a bipartisan act. And it was passed during the Reagan administration. So I think a lot of these ideas I have about bolstering formal citizenship, building that sense of civic connection, wanting to have a strong national identity, are not owned by one side of the political spectrum or the other.
Great. We have a few more questions. We'll see, depending if we can get through all of them. If we can't, I will email you the remaining questions and we'll get these answered to the folks who have asked them. The next question, Leonard Pollard is asking, considering that the data shows us that immigrants commit less crime than born citizens, improve our economy, and raise workers' wages, why do we think American immigrant sentiment is so strong?
It's a good question. And I love that you pointed out all these facts that are true about immigrants and how they compare to the native experience in the United States. I think a lot of it comes down to threat. I mean, that's my simple summary of a much more complex area of research. I think there's often a sense of economic threat, and you certainly see that in cycles throughout US history. You see it again during COVID-19 as people feel less economically secure, that they start to want to have immigration policies that ban foreign work. So, in April of 2020, there is a ban against green card holders and against H-1B workers. When people start to feel a cultural threat, I think that too makes people leery of outsiders. And I think that with COVID-19, again, you see that very strongly. In particular, a lot of the sentiment and suspicion against China, I think, blends together that sense of cultural and economic threats. So I think a lot of it has to do not with what the immigrants themselves are bringing to the table, but about the people who are receiving those immigrants.
Thank you for that. Our final question of the evening is from Todd Elderman. There are other countries that are comparable to the US in terms of the demand for and complications of citizenship, or is the US significantly unique in these respects?
So I think that sometimes we split up the world into immigrant receiving countries and immigrant sending countries. The United States historically has been an immigrant receiving country. And I think that some other examples of countries that are in that category would be Canada or the UK or Australia. And in places like that, I think you do see similar demand. And I think the complexity is starting to present itself there as well. And so I think some of the really interesting places to look for other possibilities, for how the US can move forward. Some of them are places like Canada that tend to have more open programs and much more of an institutional investment in the integration of immigrants, not just letting people become citizens if they want to, but actually helping them to build those paths, right? Sending them the reminder when they're actually eligible, letting fees not be as much of an issue as it is. Having a vetting process that is not as hostile as the one that we've started to have. So there are countries like that that simply have taken a different kind of stance toward immigration of late. But I think there are also countries that have been interesting to look at because they are starting to deal with some similar struggles in terms of the diversity of immigrants that come to the United States. That's always the knock on Canada, is that it's an unfair example because so much of the immigration to Canada is highly skilled labor. That's just how their immigration system is built. It's a system of points. But you look at other places that do have immigrants coming from a lot of places, including refugees from Syria. And those countries are interesting to watch because you can see there whether their national commitment remains or whether it starts to flag as the immigrants start to bring more challenges and to seem more distant from the mainstream. And I see the questions have multiplied.
They have multiplied. Unfortunately, we'll have to get those to you and share those out in the follow-up. I'd like to invite Dina Naya back. Hello, Dina Naya.
Here I am.
There he is.
Hi, yeah, hi everybody again. Yeah, what a great discussion, and thank you for all those questions. As those questions are coming in, Professor Chen was answering them. A number were generating in my own mind, but since I have the opportunity to see Professor Chen as a member of the faculty, I'll leave those to another time. I would thank you, Ming, Professor Chen, for a really informative presentation, and all of you for thought-provoking discussion. And also thank you, Professor Chen, for highlighting for us Constitution Day and Citizenship Day, and for giving us a lot of food for thought about fundamental dimension of the Constitution. So for everybody, by early next week, participants will receive a link to the presentation and survey to share your thoughts with us, and Colorado attorneys will receive a link for the valued CLE credit. I want to add a word of thanks to our terrific staff for making this presentation possible. Of course, thanks to Georgette Vigil for putting this all together and moderating the discussion. Thanks also to Yesenia Delgado and Teresa Coberly and others on our IT staff. Before we close, I'd like to announce that as part of our anti-racism and representation initiative, which has been fairly recently launched, Colorado Law will host a lecture series focused on the relationship between race and the law, with the objective of generating thinking about the barriers to and possibilities of the law serving as a vehicle for racial justice. The virtual series, which will feature several of our faculty members, also a panel from the City Attorney's Office, will launch in a couple of weeks, September 30, with a lecture that I'll be delivering entitled Race in the Law, Equality Dampened. So stay tuned, please, for further information on this lecture series, and also for future Colorado Law Talks. Again, thank you all for joining us. I wish you all well, health and safety during this time, and a wonderful rest of your evening. Take care.